define Christian nationalism? Because this is not a rigorous philosophy at this point. It's just a buzz phrase used to throw at people you don't like that are further to the right of you. By some people's standard, I'd be an anti-Christian nationalist, but by some people's standard, I would be a super Christian nationalist. So what does this even mean at this point?
Hey Michael, how's it going? I'm Vin and I'm a gigantic fan of yours. When you came to LA, I got a picture with you even. You're awesome and you're a big reason I'm not an atheist. The reason I'm making this is because you're my brother in Christ and I have to nuance and even critique your claims on Christian nationalism. And unfortunately, to your audience of over 500K, you presented a straw man fallacy. And I was a bit shocked, honestly, because a couple years ago you did make this video, which I was really inspired by. And you do give a concrete answer to what Christian nationalism is.
The goal of Christian nationalists is well-intended, but misguided. I agree a nation is better when the people are Christian. But we cannot make a nation more Christian through politics or a culture war. You can only make a nation Christian through evangelism. Christianity is not a political system or a culture. When you try to weaponize Christianity to be something it was never intended to be, you will always lose. It's like fighting fire with fire, when Christianity is meant to be water. The forest will burn around us, and all will suffer because of it. The lie of Christian nationalism is that we need earthly powers to save the church. Our mission must first be political. But this is what Satan offered Jesus. Take the political and cultural road to growing your kingdom. Seize the nations, and with that power, you can make Christianity supreme. Christian nationalism is national self-worship disguised as Christianity. A nation of Christian nationalists is not a nation of Christians.
So even by your own standards set beforehand a long time ago, it does have a concrete definition. But now we have this reel, which is unfortunately a far cry from that said position. So in that video, you openly denounced the political pride behind Christian nationalism, the culture war slop, and even the strong border against outsiders thing, which is very resembling of how Donald Trump uses ICE today. You also called out both sides using Christianity for their political agenda, and only the gospel can change people, which I'm completely behind. I'll be the first to say progressive Christianity puts Jesus in a box that he doesn't belong in. But I don't know what happened to the position in that old video. I don't know what happened to the nuance in this Jubilee episode. Why go from accurately defining a specific dangerous ideology to pretending the concept doesn't even exist? Let's begin.
I think one way to define Christian nationalism or the exclusive incorporation of Christian ideals and messaging in a government's speeches, documents, laws, all of that jazz. Want to keep the separation of church and state. I don't think that any religious persuasion should be in the speeches and the governance and the laws
Back
of a
to your
country.
definitions. Again, by both of those definitions, James Talarico is a Christian nationalist because he has said he's going to be led by his Christian convictions, albeit his progressive interpretation of Christianity. But by that logic, he's a Christian nationalist.
Now, I actually agree with this guy that this is one way to define Christian nationalism, but keep in mind one huge key phrase, separation of church and state, because it's a big part of a certain person you're about to criticize his platform. Even by this definition, this is a far bigger problem on the right when Donald Trump recently advocated for his Religious Liberty Commission to challenge separation of church and state. The left doesn't do this. As vocal as we are against the left, they're actually on the correct side of history when it comes to this doctrine. But instead of addressing state power, you pivoted to James Talarico, claiming that by the atheist logic, Talarico is a Christian nationalist too, just because he lets his faith inform his public policies. But my guy, you know that's shifting the goalposts. Now, to be perfectly fair, I have been called a Christian nationalist before by the left. In this video right here, where it's just a bunch of Christians worshiping an event, yeah, that's not Christian nationalism. I completely agree with you that the left can misuse that word. But since you and I are both critical thinkers, at least when you approached this more honestly years ago, we know that Christian nationalism is a self-centered worldly ideology. It's nationalism first and Christian second. It puts country pride and interprets Christian law based on a narrow worldview. Doug Wilson even wrote this book where he gives a case for Christian nationalism alongside this best-selling book by Stephen Wolfe that came out in 2022. If you don't know who the latter is, he's made biblical cases for slavery and repealing women's suffrage. Maybe we should be more vocal against this guy because the president's actually giving him a platform. Yeah, who's the one being vocally endorsed by the Christian right now, specifically Secretary Pete Hegseth? Definitely not Talarico. There's honestly a night and day difference between Christians letting their faith shape their personal moral convictions within a pluralistic democracy, as opposed to Christian nationalism, which tries to co-opt the authority of the state to enforce religious supremacy. Honestly, it kind of sucks seeing you using this playbook because we've seen this card get played by Allie Beth Stuckey on Benjamin Kramer for calling out Christian nationalism, or Frank Turek deflecting to the left and pretending that they're the actual Christian nationalists. But regrettably, that's intellectually lazy on their part. Now, in your original video, you're above that. You literally pointed to the temptation of Christ where Satan offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their political power. Jesus turned down that earthly authority because he knew no government, mandate, or political machine could ever substitute the transforming power of the gospel. You did understand the danger of using Caesar's sword to build God's kingdom back then, and it's a bit sad to see you use a deflection right now in this Jubilee video when you already know the theological truth. But anyways.
So is a Christian nationalist only when it's being done on the right and not on the left? Because he's very well saying, I think Jesus teaches this, therefore I'm going to implement policies like this. The way people define Christian nationalism is so silly at this point.
Now we have to think for a moment, is this the kind of government that James Talarico wants? It's pretty well documented that he's actually the biggest opponent of any religious involvement in the state, which I'll get to in a bit. Now in your original video, you do correctly call out the political left and right for putting Jesus in a box. In fact, I have called out James Talarico multiple times, especially for his theology on abortion, where he tries to use Luke 1 to justify it. Calling that out has gotten me heat from the left. Now, the reason why at the end of the day, James Talarico is not a Christian nationalist, even by the atheist panelist terms, is because he completely lacks the core of Christian nationalism, which is the idea of religious supremacy. Assuming we replace Trump with Talarico as our president, I'd actually be more wary of a secular government than any form of Christian nationalist government, because isn't that what we both fear that the left wants, especially in documented instances of communist societies trying to erase religion and whatnot? I think a Christian nationalist government is the least of our worries if the left ever took over our government. We have to be consistent here. Is it secularism or is it Christian nationalism the threat of the left? And for what it's worth, I agreed with most of your video on secularism, and I think a society would function best under religion, especially Christianity. But having a nation of genuine Christ-following Christians isn't the same as following the agenda of Christian nationalism, which is just a political prop that pushes state pride over actual faith. Which, speaking of, you will bring up something in this next clip, which I wanted to touch on why separation of church and state matters.
And I want to understand, when you say that the way in which you're defining Christian nationalism is like these references, I mean, the Declaration of Independence is also quite clear. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. But we do have religious tendencies. But most of our founding fathers very much believed in prayer. I say this quite comfortably as a Jew, that we Jews need to be thankful to Christians. Christians brought messianic expectations. Christians brought monotheism to societies in ways that Jews never did.
Oh, and to add to that, you like separation of church and state. Historians agree that the separation of church and state was a Christian idea. It came out of Jesus saying, render to Caesar this things that are Caesar. Then it goes through Augustine's City of God, goes into the Augsburg Confession, and it starts to manifest in, again, the Protestant Reformation to what we got here. So it's a Christian idea. Does being pro-separation of church and state mean you want Christian ideas in the government and therefore you're a Christian nationalist?
Yeah, Michael, it's really important to note why separation of church and state exists, because to say it's Christian idea is an oversimplification. The separation of church and state was made to protect the church from state corruption, not to create a purely secular public space. In fact, 17th century theologian Roger Williams, who coined the phrase wall of separation, argued that whenever political authority mixes with religious doctrine, it doesn't make the government godly, it just degrades and pollutes genuine Christian faith. He advocated for separation of church and state to keep Caesar's sword from controlling the conscience of believers. All of this was helpful in influencing the First Amendment as we know it. Yeah, take a look at Talarico's record in the Texas state and study his platform. When Texas Republicans pushed a bill to force public schools to display the Ten Commandments, Talarico stood on the House floor and fought against it. He pretty much used theological grounds to argue that the power of the state to enforce religion onto students of other faiths was idolatrous, exclusionary, and deeply unchristian. He defends separation of church and state because of his faith, and someone like me, I argue that religion doesn't need government mandates because it hurts the legitimacy of the gospel. No matter how much you and I disagree with Talarico's theology, he's correct. Separation of church and state is something that we need in our pluralistic society.
Now, I'll agree with you that I don't want governors and presidents talking about God this and the Bible that, and certainly Talarico has had a lot of religious language as a candidate. And I would condemn him if he comes into government and makes woke Christianity, like the official state religion of Texas.
I just kind of get a little annoyed with, if he was a conservative, MAGA hardcore, people would be condemning him as an authoritarian, MAGA Christian nationalist. But he's talking about Jesus so much, and everyone on the left is like, oh, bravo, bravo, this is great. But by your own logic, we on the right should be calling him an authoritarian Christian nationalist.
Going back to Talarico one more time, and coming from a conservative theological Christian like myself, well, we use our faith to protect pluralism and religious freedom for everyone. We want to make sure that state authority can't pick a preferred religion. Christian nationalism does the exact opposite. It seeks to dismantle pluralism, it uses state coercion to enforce religion, and it tries to establish Christian dominance. And I'll say this again, the left is actually on the right side of history for once. There's a ton of nuance, unfortunately, you missed here. The left, who's mostly secular or even anti-religious, is rallying behind Talarico because he's advocating for separation of church and state. Plus, if you check out my platform sometime, Mike, you'll see that the religious right is openly vocal for some things, not other things. It's pretty much selective morality. For example, we conservative Christians are very correct in calling out the evils of abortion. The Christian right, however, is not vocal enough against the sin of greed, corruption, racism, neglect of the poor, mistreating LGBTQ people, mistreating immigrants, idolatry of Donald Trump over Jesus Christ, and even Christian nationalism. I've seen the conversation maybe once or twice, and of course you posted this reel to your audience the way you wanted it to come off. So based on this, I mean, conflating someone who brings personal faith into a pluralistic democracy with a movement that uses state power to coerce people to destroy pluralism too, that is unfortunately just sloppy logic. So I'm almost curious why you want to hold Donald Trump to the same standard, who by every metric is a Christian nationalist, regardless of whether or not he's a Christian. Well, I don't think he is, but still. He virtue signals to Christians wanting Christian values for the nation. Check. The government should be Christian. Check. We need a Christian theocracy. Check. He gives all these layers of Christian nationalism a megaphone. All these kinds of layers of Christian nationalism are rallied behind the political right, which Talarico is openly vocal against. So Michael, I'm still wondering what happened to your old position in your old anti-Christian nationalist video. Genuinely, I really do hope you return to that, because at least it was nonpartisan and it was intellectually honest. Anyway, I hope you learned something from this. God bless.